Eleanor Marsh stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the swaying oak trees that lined the edge of their family estate. At 65, she had come to treasure quiet mornings like this, warm coffee in her hand, the faint hum of classical music in the background, and her husband Bernard shuffling through the newspaper in the next room. Their home, a sprawling two-story country house nestled at the edge of Willow Creek, had been their sanctuary for nearly 4 decades. Bernard, a retired architect with a fondness for antique clocks, always said the house had a soul, and Eleanor believed it. But lately, that soul felt uneasy. It started with the arrival of their son, Martin, and his wife, Celeste. "We just need a place to stay for a few weeks," Martin had said over the phone 2 months ago. "Celeste lost her job, and I'm between contracts. We're just a little tight right now." Eleanor, ever the mother, had agreed without hesitation. Bernard had been more cautious. He always said Martin had a way of charming his way into things, especially when money was involved. But Eleanor had waved off his concerns. "He's our son, Bernie. What else are we supposed to do?" Bernard had sighed, muttering something about boundaries, but he hadn't argued further. Now, with the weeks stretching into months and no talk of leaving, the air inside the house had changed. Eleanor noticed doors being closed quietly behind her, whispered conversations she couldn't quite catch, and Martin spending long hours locked in Bernard's old study. That morning, as she sipped her coffee and watched a squirrel dart across the lawn, she felt the first real stirrings of dread in her chest, a mother's instinct sharpening into something far more ominous. The shift was subtle at first, like a breeze turning cold in late summer. Bernard had grown more withdrawn. He didn't trust Celeste, never had. "She looks at this house like it's already hers," he told Eleanor one night as they lay in bed, their whispers barely disturbing the silence. "And Martin's not blind. He sees what she's after. But he's too weak to stop her." Eleanor had tried to reason with him. "They're struggling. You know how hard things have been since the layoffs." Bernard had scoffed. "They're not struggling. They're scheming." That word stuck with Eleanor longer than she admitted. Still, she tried to keep peace. She baked more, hosted quiet family dinners, laughed a little louder to chase the tension away. But Celeste barely lifted a finger. She scrolled through her phone at the table, interrupted conversations with smug anecdotes, and had recently begun bringing up the idea of modernizing the house. "You could sell that grandfather clock, you know," Celeste mentioned casually one evening, her eyes trailing the intricate brass design that Bernard cherished. "It's just gathering dust." Bernard's lips tightened. "That clock's older than you," he replied flatly, "and a damn sight more valuable." Martin chuckled nervously, trying to ease the mood, but Celeste only shrugged and murmured, "Sentimental clutter." Eleanor hated how fast the room cooled after that. The next morning, Bernard discovered that several of his files, architectural drawings and property documents, were missing from the study. "Did you move them?" he asked Eleanor. She shook her head. That night, Bernard changed the locks on his office, but even then, he didn't feel safe. And neither, he suspected, should Eleanor. Something was beginning to rot beneath the surface of their home, and it wore the face of family. It happened on a Sunday, one of those warm afternoons when time felt slow and lazy. Eleanor had just come in from the garden, her gloves streaked with soil, and Bernard was in the basement checking the old circuit breaker that had been acting up. Martin had offered to help. "Let me take a look, Dad," he said with unusual cheer. "You've been fiddling with that thing for weeks." Bernard hesitated, but handed over the flashlight and nodded toward the narrow basement steps. "Be careful down there," he muttered. Celeste appeared moments later, her smile sharp and gleaming. "Eleanor, do you have a moment? I want to show you something in the guest room." Eleanor followed without thinking, still wearing her gloves, dirt still under her nails. She never saw it coming. The door slammed behind her with a force that shook the hinges. Eleanor spun around just in time to hear the click of the lock. "Martin," she called. "Celeste? What on earth is going on?" There was no answer. Downstairs, Bernard heard the same sound, the scrape of metal, the thud of a heavy lock sliding into place above him. "Hey," he shouted. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Martin's voice came through the closed door, muffled but steady. Just for a little while, Dad. You need to rest. It's better this way. Bernard pounded on the door. You open this damn door right now. Upstairs, Eleanor beat her fists against the guest room walls, trying to push the window open, but it had been nailed shut. She realized, with a rising sense of horror, that this wasn't a mistake. It was planned. Every movement, every moment, calculated, coordinated. She was trapped. Bernard was trapped. And their own son had turned the key. The hours stretched into a disorienting silence, broken only by the occasional creak of footsteps above them. Eleanor sat on the edge of the guest bed, her body shaking as she tried to piece together the betrayal. It didn't make sense, or maybe it did, and she just never wanted to see it. She thought of Martin as a little boy, always building things with Bernard in the garage, always asking for stories before bed. But that boy had vanished somewhere along the way, replaced by a man she barely recognized. Bernard, meanwhile, paced in the cold basement, rage coiled tight in his chest. There after the house, he muttered aloud, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. They want the deeds, the accounts, everything. He searched the room with his eyes, checking for any tool, any means of escape. But the door was thick, the lock reinforced. He could hear movement upstairs, Celeste's voice, laughing at something on the phone. She's calling someone, he realized grimly. Probably a lawyer. Probably planning how to make us legally dead. Meanwhile, Eleanor pressed her ear to the wall. Bernie, she called, her voice trembling. A pause. Then, I'm here, Elle. What do we do? We wait. And we listen. Eleanor felt the lump rise in her throat. She never imagined a world where her own child would lock her away, like an old memory. But Bernard's voice kept her grounded. They think we're weak, that we won't fight back. But they've forgotten who we are, Elle. She whispered, we raised him better than this. Bernard replied, low and grim, we did. But they made their move. Now it's our turn. Upstairs, Martin and Celeste moved swiftly. They had rehearsed everything. The forged power of attorney was nearly complete, just one signature away. Once it's notarized, Celeste said, scrolling through her laptop, we can transfer the house into your name. Everything will fall into place. Martin nodded, though his hands were trembling. Are we doing the right thing? He asked, the flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time. Celeste barely looked up. Martin, your parents are living in a fantasy. They hoard everything. They barely let you touch your own inheritance. We're just correcting the imbalance. He said nothing. In the basement, Bernard had begun prying open a vent shaft with a rusted broom handle. It was narrow, maybe enough to push a note through. Elle, he said, help me write something. Something short. Something someone might find. Eleanor rummaged through the drawers until she found an old pencil and a receipt. She wrote in sharp, frantic strokes. Trapped in our own house. Help. Eleanor and Bernard Marsh. 172, Willow Creek Lane. They slipped the note into the vent, praying it would find its way out. Bernard leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. We have to believe someone will come, Eleanor said. Bernard nodded. And if not, we find another way. We don't give them the ending they want. Above them, the sound of laughter drifted down through the floorboards, light, easy, victorious. But the Marshes were not broken. Not yet. Morning light seeped through the basement window, thin and gray. Bernard hadn't slept. He kept thinking about all the small signs he'd ignored, Martin's evasive answers, Celeste's sudden interest in old documents, the way they walked around the house like they already owned it. Eleanor had managed to sleep for a few hours, curled up with a blanket pulled from the closet. Now she stood by the guest room door, listening for any movement. She heard none. They're letting us rot in here, she muttered. Bernard's voice came back, steady. They won't keep us forever. They'll need something from us soon. Sure enough, later that afternoon, there came a knock, soft, rehearsed. Celeste's voice floated through the guest room door. Eleanor, we need you to sign something. Eleanor stared at the door. What is it? She asked flatly. Just a document giving us temporary authority to handle the house's legal affairs, Celeste answered, tone too sweet. It's really just a formality. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her voice cold. You locked us in here like animals, and now you want our signatures? A pause. Then Celeste's voice hardened. You don't have a choice. If you cooperate, we'll let you go. Eventually. Bernard shouted from below, You think you've won something, but you're playing with fire. We're saving this house from your neglect. Martin chimed in, his voice less certain. You two should be thanking us. Eleanor stood, her back straight. Tell Martin, she said loud enough for both to hear, that the boy I raised would have rather starved than betray his family. I don't know who you are now. Silence followed. But in that silence, Eleanor's resolve hardened into steel. 2 more days passed. The air grew stale. Food had stopped coming after Eleanor refused to sign the document. Celeste had left a tray of dry crackers and a bottle of water, which Eleanor pushed back out. They're testing us, Bernard said, seeing how long we'll bend before we break. Eleanor shook her head. They've underestimated how long we've been holding this house together. Let's see how long they last pretending they know how it works. Bernard began tapping into old habits, counting seconds between footfalls, memorizing times when they heard movement above, noting when the plumbing was used. They're still here, he muttered, scratching notes with a paperclip onto the concrete. They haven't called any lawyer yet. That forgery, maybe it didn't go through. Meanwhile, Eleanor did what she'd always done best. She listened. She heard Martin pacing at night. She heard Celeste arguing, sometimes about money, sometimes about what to do next. They're slipping, she whispered one night through the vent. Their little plan is cracking. Bernard grinned grimly. Good. Let them feel the edge of the walls closing in. That night, they got a break. Eleanor's note, the one they'd shoved through the vent, had been found. A teenage neighbor, delivering flyers, had spotted the corner of the paper fluttering outside the grate. He read it, called the police, and by morning, 2 officers stood at the front door of the Marsh estate, knocking. Celeste opened the door with her usual painted-on smile. Good morning, officers. Is something wrong? Her voice was sugar, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. One of the officers held up the crumpled note. We received this from someone on your property. Do Bernard and Eleanor Marsh reside here? Celeste hesitated. They're away, visiting friends. They left a few days ago. Martin appeared behind her, pale and startled. What's going on? The second officer narrowed his eyes. Can we have a look around? Celeste tried to stall. I don't think they'd want strangers in their home, but the officer had already stepped inside. Martin stepped back, chest rising and falling fast. We didn't hurt them, he blurted suddenly. We just needed time to figure things out. Celeste shot him a murderous glare, but it was too late. The officers moved quickly, voices raised, searching the house. Within minutes, they found Eleanor in the locked guest room, pale but upright, her expression stoic. Downstairs, Bernard shouted with relief when the basement door creaked open. Took you long enough, he said hoarsely. The officers escorted the stunned couple upstairs. Eleanor paused when she saw Martin, his face drained of color. Was it worth it? She asked quietly. He couldn't answer. Celeste tried to run. She made it as far as the porch before another officer blocked her path. Handcuffs clicked. For a moment, all Eleanor heard was the sound of her own breathing. Then Bernard stepped beside her, and they stood together, unbroken. The following week moved in a blur, police interviews, a court hearing, press inquiries. The betrayal became a local scandal. Parents locked in basement by greedy son and daughter-in-law. The headline screamed. But Eleanor refused to let it define her. We survived, she said simply to the reporters. Bernard wasn't as forgiving. He hired a lawyer within hours of their release. They forged documents, committed fraud, held us against our will, he told the attorney. Make sure they understand what consequences look like. Martin and Celeste were charged with unlawful confinement and attempted property fraud. Martin, shaken and remorseful, pled guilty. Celeste fought it, hiring a slick lawyer who tried to paint them as caretakers acting in desperation. But the court wasn't swayed. Meanwhile, Eleanor went room by room, cleansing the house. She opened windows, burned old letters, tossed out Celeste's cosmetics and overpriced handbags. She tried to erase us, Eleanor told Bernard as she boxed up forgotten picture frames. Now I'm erasing her. Bernard nodded but stayed quiet. He was grieving, not for the house or the lost papers, but for the son he no longer recognized. One evening, Eleanor found him on the back porch, staring into the dark trees. Do you think he ever loved us? Bernard didn't answer at first. Then he said, I think he did, but not enough to fight what he became. She sat beside him, and for a long time, neither said anything more. A month passed. The house was quiet again, almost too quiet. Eleanor had taken up gardening with new intensity, planting wildflowers across the yard, letting nature reclaim what had been suffocating. Bernard returned to his sketches, redrawing the house from memory, room by room, as if restoring something sacred. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Martin. No return address. Just a folded page inside. I'm sorry, it read. I didn't know how to stop her. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know who I was without her pushing me. Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she burned it in the fireplace without a word. You're not angry? Bernard asked. No, she said softly. Just done. She had spent years making excuses for a son who never looked back unless he needed something. Now she was learning to let go. That evening, they invited their neighbor, the teenager who found the note, for dinner. He came shyly, wearing his best shirt. You saved our lives, Eleanor said warmly as she served him apple pie. You have a good heart. The boy blushed, mumbling something about luck. But Eleanor and Bernard knew better. Sometimes, salvation came from unexpected places. Sometimes, family was found in strangers. And sometimes, surviving meant choosing peace over answers. They repaired the guest room last. Eleanor painted the walls a pale yellow and replaced the heavy bed with something smaller, lighter. No locks, she told Bernard. Not on any doors. Bernard didn't argue. But he did add a second phone line in the basement. Just in case, he said quietly. They laughed, though it was the kind of laugh that came from deep wounds. Visitors came and went. Friends who had heard the news, extended family offering awkward sympathy. Eleanor remained polite, but distant. She no longer needed everyone to understand. The ones who mattered had stood by her. One evening, she walked out to the oak trees and buried something beneath them, a small metal box with a few old photos of Martin as a boy. She didn't want to display them anymore. But she didn't want to destroy them either. This was the boy I loved, she whispered. I'll keep him safe here. The rest can stay buried. Bernard stood a few feet away, silent witness to his wife's quiet mourning. They held hands on the way back to the house. The past no longer held them prisoner. The walls that once confined them now stood as testament to their survival. Bernard's sketches became more intricate as the weeks passed. He filled a notebook with redesigned rooms, sunlit corridors, and expanded garden spaces. It's therapeutic, he told Eleanor, taking back control of a place they tried to steal. She smiled. It's beautiful. In one drawing, he'd added a small bench under the kitchen window, just for her. They started spending evenings there, sipping tea as the sun set behind the trees. Sometimes they spoke of the betrayal. Sometimes they didn't. But there was always an unspoken truth between them. They were still here. And the house, their home, was still theirs. They hosted a small gathering in the garden. Nothing fancy, just tea, music, and stories. Their neighbors came, bringing laughter and light. The house breathed again, no longer a prison, but a place of welcome. Eleanor looked around at the smiling faces and thought, this is what family should feel like. Not bloodlines. Not last names, but kindness, safety, truth. Bernard touched her shoulder, pointing at a small girl playing by the flower beds. She reminds me of you, he said. Eleanor chuckled. You always did have a romantic streak. The moment felt full, simple, and earned. Late that night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Eleanor found herself awake. She wandered into the study and opened an old journal, one she hadn't touched in years. Page by page, she wrote down what had happened. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for memory, for clarity. Sometimes the wounds that cut the deepest come from the people closest to you, she wrote. But even then, healing is still a choice. We don't have to stay broken. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside her favorite novels. In the hallway, Bernard was adjusting the old grandfather clock Celeste had once mocked. Still ticking, he said. Eleanor smiled. Just like us. They stood there, surrounded by things others tried to take from them. Time, peace, love, and felt whole again. Not untouched, not unscarred, but whole. The seasons changed. Autumn came with golden leaves and cool winds. The house glowed in warm tones, firelight, candles, soft wool blankets folded at the foot of chairs. Eleanor hosted baking afternoons with neighborhood children. Bernard taught sketching classes to a few curious teens. The house was no longer silent. It had a heartbeat again. Sometimes, late at night, Eleanor would glance toward the guest room and feel a chill. Not from fear, from memory. But it passed quickly. We are not what was done to us, she told herself. We are what we choose after. Bernard bought her a new garden lamp, bright, solar-powered, and unmissable. So you'll never feel in the dark again, he said with a wink. And she didn't. Not anymore. Years later, no one talked much about the scandal. Martin served his time quietly, disappeared afterward. Celeste filed for divorce in prison and was last seen in another state under a different name. For Eleanor and Bernard, the past became just another chapter, painful but finished. One evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the fields, Eleanor stood at the window with Bernard beside her, fingers interlocked. We were nearly erased, she said softly. But we weren't, Bernard replied, because we remembered who we are. They stood there in silence, not as victims of betrayal, but as survivors of it, two people who had once been locked away and forgotten, now living with doors wide open.